Welcome, gamers and game curious. I'm your host, Spike Murphy Rose, and this is RPG Obsession, the podcast where passion meets inspiration. In today's episode, I have the pleasure of interviewing YouTube creator and professional Dungeons & Dragons scholar, AJ Pickett. Let's hear what he has to say. So, most folks know you from your Mighty Glue Stick YouTube channel, where you have delved into every bit of lore one could possibly imagine for D&D, the Forgotten Realms, and just tons of other D&D adjacent settings and tidbits of lore. So how did you start doing that in the first place?
Well, the reason why the channel was called the Mighty Glue Stick, unofficially, it's always been AJ Pickett. So you find it that way when you type into the search bar. The Mighty Glue Stick came about from me being a crafting channel. So I started doing the YouTube so I could communicate with a group of people on a message board that were associated with DM Scotty and the crafting community. So crafting community being people who make their own miniatures and terrain for Dungeons & Dragons and other role-playing games. And we would have a monthly competition based on a theme where a bunch of people would make the same sort of thing, and we would compete amongst ourselves for, infamy, really. Mm-hmm. And so that was why I started making these videos. And I also, my very first video on YouTube was me creating a beholder from scratch, and scratch building a beholder. And that's still my go-to miniature that I like making is my own beholders, because every single one's different.
Right, and they should be, because they're all generated by dreams, right?
Yeah,
at least that's the lore.
That's the lore. So then eventually one day while I was making a roper, and I got a suggestion from this guy Gareth, who's also Dungeon Master Gareth, who's also part of the crafting community. And he said, why don't you talk about the monster and the lore of the monster while you're creating it? And I thought that's a very good idea. So that is exactly what I started to do. And then eventually the crafting fell by the wayside and the lore became the focus of my channel. And I'm very thankful that it did. He was also the one who suggested to me that I script my videos. And that is also a very, very good suggestion, because not only does it give me a massive archive of writing material, it also gave me some really good writing skills and allowed me to discipline myself, format my videos, and give a better cadence to the way I speak and things when I'm making them.
I hadn't thought about the way that would help with the skills improvement with the writing, as well as just obviously making your videos more structured. It's the same reason why I made sure to write down all my questions first.
You're right. But it gives you some very good feedback from if you use Grammarly or similar sort of software. It gives you all this analytics of what you do. And it says that I use more unique words than 90% of other people. And also over the last year, I've written 430,000 words, which is the equivalent of 4 novels. So I'm thinking to myself, I could write books. Why am I making videos? But, there you go.
Yeah, well, and though, to be fair, how many of those 90% unique words are just dragon names that were made up by Ed Greenwood?
Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of syllables in those things. Cringe Shinabon.
Oh man, though I do love the dragon names that Ed gave us, and just the many different languages of the realms. Now so you got started with the crafting. How did you get into crafting in the first place? Because not everyone always uses miniatures when they game, and some folks just get into the crafting or diorama making, and it's not even necessarily gaming related.
That has just always been it's part of my DNA. So when I was a little kid, living in New Zealand, we just didn't have action figures and toys and things like that. So I'd see these things on television and I'd be, oh, that's great. But I was just a farm kid, and we had a limited budget for everything. I was lucky to get books. So I got into the habit of, I grabbed plasticine and I'd make figures out of plasticine. I got very good at making little men out of plasticine. And then I would use moldable and bakeable epoxy stuff like Fimo and Sculpey sort of stuff, where you just you make it and then bake it in the oven and it turns into a plastic material. So I would make armor sets and weapons and things, and I'd have spikes on the thing so I could stick it onto the figures that I made. And so I made my own action figures that were infinitely reusable, and they could have fights where they actually got their arms and legs cut off and things. And so I ended up with this huge armory of weapons and armor and all sorts of stuff. And I studied, historical armor and things like that, and was making all these these fanciful things. And that's basically how I got into sculpture. And that's always been one of my main focuses. Is I'm a much better sculptor than I am an artist. I really had to work at sketching and things like that. But eventually I studied graphic design and things like that. So it's always, back in the day when I was in school, there was no such thing as YouTube. We barely, I'm of the generation that started using computers. So, I remember the days where there was no such thing as cell phones and instant messaging and things like that. People had to use telegrams, and the idea of having a video conference chat with somebody in another country was just unbelievable sci-fi.
Oh, yeah. Literally.
So, yeah, literally. So, cell phones were something that you see on Star Trek, not in real life.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so eventually it became a cross skill that I could use in my gaming. And again, it saved me a lot of money. So when Dwarven Forge and things were first making stuff, I was already crafting my own sort of 3D terrain and things like that, and making monster miniatures out of plasticine. And yeah.
Well, that was, for Stefan Picorni, who made Dwarven Forge, it was
Exactly.
much the same with how he got started. I remember, one time when he and I were getting to hang out a bit, and he was talking about that. And, of course, he had a documentary talking about it, too. But it's just fascinating to see that passion for crafting that it is there throughout the gaming. It seems to be a thread that runs through gaming and has since its start. And how were you researching medieval and historical armor sets before the internet? That is, I'm curious, because it's not the type of stuff that every library is going to have materials on. I remember the Osprey books were a big resource for me as a kid, and they had here's the armor of Macedonia from 700 to 800 BC and stuff. And
well, I was lucky enough to have a father and mother who did collect books. So my dad had a pretty good, solid collection of pulp 1960s, 1950s, 1940s sci-fi books. So Heinlein, Asimov, Pohl, all sorts of really good stuff. And he also had a collection of encyclopedias. And we occasionally had Reader's Digest books of arms and armor and historical, weapons and armor through the ages and things like that. And I've always been pretty fascinated with that because there's a lot of history tied up with the development of all these different weapons and things, even these days I watch videos on these historical societies who recreate weapons from the American Civil War and just after and things like that, and all of these evolutions and revolutions that happened with weapons and armor development through the years, mainly because of necessity. So yeah, it was really interesting. I won't go and don't get me down that rabbit hole because I can talk about that for hours. You would honestly, anybody who listens to a role player who's played a lot of modern games with firearms and stuff like that would think that there's some sort of obsessed gun nut. But honestly, it's just, we have weapons and things in New Zealand, but I'm not really a firearms person. I go hunting and stuff. Yeah, but I do have a slug gun for killing pukekos, but that's about it.
Yeah, well, you got to have something. I know it's not Australia where everything is.
No, I live out in an orchard in Hobbiton. Basically, there's no snarling predators. There's no bears or lions or tigers out here. You'd be lucky if you get bitten by an aggressive spider if you're very, very unfortunate.
Though I did see the Tasmanian devil is making a comeback, so who knows? Maybe it might end up on New Zealand shores.
Yeah, well, if we ever dig a tunnel between the two countries and have a high-speed cargo tube or something, then we'll probably get snakes and spiders. But at the moment, New Zealand is literally a country where you can go cavorting naked through the wilderness and nothing will harm you. It's ridiculous.
Well, that sounds just wonderfully pleasant. But I guess that's why Middle Earth is set there.
Yeah, so, the most dangerous thing out in the wilderness here is plants and cold. That's it. We get educated on hypothermia from a very young age in New Zealand. It does get pretty chilly.
Yeah,
not at the moment though. It's 30 degrees Celsius, which is about 86 Fahrenheit. So it's pretty steamy.
Oh, that's pretty nice. Yeah. Well, I'm on the California coast here, so it is, we usually, and where I live on the coast, it's usually between 50 and 80 most of the year, regardless.
And a dry heat, right?
Well, I'm on the coast, so I get, it is a little drier, but it's not too bad. We have a Mediterranean, I'm in wine country, so it's like a Mediterranean environment here, or climate.
Oh, nice.
I should say.
I did actually get out to California once, and that was in the springtime. So I was lucky enough to see the lupins and things like that. The Californians were raving about the lupins on the side of the road and how lucky I was to see them. Of course, coming from New Zealand, it was a bit It's like telling an elf that your architecture is pretty,
Right.
It's a bit wasted on me.
Yeah, yeah. It's I definitely feel that way. It's different than I lived in Indiana in the Midwest for a while, where it's very cold and very flat, and just the
Mm.
terrain is uninteresting. I definitely came to just miss living in a place where that was stimulating to look at.
Yeah, I
Uh,
could not live in the middle of outback Australia or the middle of the Great Plains of America because I
mhm.
need mountains in my life. I have to have them to survive. I cannot stand just an unbroken horizon all around me. I just want to leave.
That's that dwarven heritage, right?
It's got to be. It's got to be.
So, did the making your own like action figures and accessories and terrain, is that part of what eventually led you toward studying I guess like chemistry and like chemical engineering and stuff, because you did just recently release your Big Pockets line of silicone gaming aid products, which are
Mm.
great. And it's hard not to see that kind of origin there and how it leads to that. And you also, uh, I mean, I know you got a degree in biological sciences at the University of Waikato, right?
Yep. I didn't actually finish that. I got 3 years of study in, and I just, as an adult student, I didn't need a degree. So I was there mainly for just learning. Sounds a bit strange, but I went there, paid for an education, and got a social education mainly, and also a lesson to never get into politics because that was what drove me away from the whole
Mm,
institution. And yeah, I don't really believe in universities anymore. But it was good because that got me all of my friends that I currently game with and got me really back into role playing quite a lot because we had a very tight, good gaming community in the Waikato University. And I've maintained those friendships ever since for the last decade or so. So yeah. But I did study biological science and I did go into the industry and work at a genetics lab doing PCR testing, which is everybody's
mm-hmm.
now familiar with PCR testing because of
Yup,
COVID. But at the time,
unfortunately.
we were doing that for livestock for genetic stuff so that, you could get better dairy cows, essentially.
Yeah,
So,
the
yeah,
Livestock Improvement Corporation, right? They
that's
have a
right.
whole
Yeah,
suite of services for that. For if you want to, technocratically manage your livestock, they have every
yeah,
solution you need.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. For a price.
Right.
But it was a very, very good, very efficient company, very, very hardworking team of people that did an enormous amount of work. And yeah, that was a good experience. But it's one of those jobs where it sounds really like technical and there is a steep sort of learning curve with genetics, but really what you're doing most of the day is squirting things into other things and washing dishes and
hmm
watching robots. It's a kind of a grind job that, yeah, it's
Yeah.
I like my jobs boring. I don't know what I like a learning curve, and then I like just steady, like no
Yeah.
surprises, go into do the work, go home sort of thing. And as long as we got the job done and nobody was on our backs, we didn't have to deal with customers. It was fine. Yeah, it was a good job. But eventually, I ended up earning more money through YouTube than I did at my actual lab job, and so I thought, well, time to quit, and I did.
Yeah. It sounds great. I mean, I understand the busy work aspect. My dad's a scientist, so many summers I spent earning, well, for legal reasons, we won't say how little he paid me, but very small amounts of money to rack, just thousands of pipette tips or do dishes, or there's a lot of
There's a
repetitiveness.
There is a lot of repetitiveness, yeah, and a lot of plastics and things used in the industry, but it's actually fairly efficient, and there's a lot of
hmm
recycling and sciences and
Oh,
stuff.
absolutely. And I think these days most folks would yearn for that type of just stability and repetitiveness in earning a living, at least in the past couple of years with the way things have been so haywire. But
Mm.
so the interest, so it wasn't the education that led toward toward big pockets and toward diving into that. It seems it was rather that was just yet another way that you expressed that creativity that you had been delving into
Yeah,
since a kid.
that was the inspiration behind Big Pockets and using silicon rubber and as opposed to vinyls for game mats and things was both a frustration in the fact that they're using plastics to produce these products which have a limited life. Like the
hmm
vinyls aren't going to last forever. I know there's people who take very good care of them and will argue that they'll last a lifetime. But there's also a lot of those vinyl mats which end up going into landfill. I wanted to
hmm
produce something that was. I have this idea, and this is inspired kind of by Warhammer 40k. Bear with me here,
Okay.
where the technology and things that you get in Warhammer 40k, this post-apocalyptic, far future game where the technology is kind of revered like a religion, is
Yeah.
these almost indestructible items, technological artifacts from a bygone golden era. And I'm like, we're living in a golden era right now. Why are we not producing products using the strongest and longest lasting materials we possibly can produce? And so that was what I set out to do, was to produce a superior product that was going to last literally your whole lifetime. You just give it some modest amounts of maintenance and it will perform its function perfectly. Not only that, but it also serves as a pretty good surface for painting miniatures and things like that, because nothing sticks to the stuff. Like you can pour your entire load of acrylic or even spirit-based paints all over it and nothing touches it. About the only thing that you could damage it with was super glue. And yeah, even epoxy resins and things like that will just peel straight off it again. So it's absolutely ideal for making models and miniatures and things.
Ooh,
Anyway,
I hadn't thought about that.
yeah, well, I mean, you can bake a pizza, like demonstrated. You can bake a pizza on it in the oven. So it's a silicon
I knew you could bake a pizza
sheet.
on it. I just didn't think to paint a miniature on it. But yeah, that makes sense. And
so yeah, it's a very good, and I've also seen people using it as a base that they put their other maps and miniatures and things on, because it's a pretty good friction surface that paper and stuff doesn't shift around on. So yeah, it's got a lot of different applications.
I actually got
and protects your table against like metal dice and stuff rolling on wooden surfaces.
Oh, that's part of why I always laid down a mat, even if I wasn't planning to do a lot of like combat or anything, or if I had terrain built, because I wanted to protect the table as well.
Yeah,
that's why I got the transparent hex map for one of mine, so that I can lay it over, say, like area maps and stuff like that, and overland maps, so that I can do travel and hex crawls and that type of thing. So
yeah, we
really
tried to get it
product.
as transparent as we could. We couldn't get it completely transparent because we needed a slightly textured surface so that it would you could actually put whiteboard markers and permanent markers on it, and that would actually, because they need a texture there to actually
to grab onto. Yeah.
Yeah. So unfortunately, that makes it a little bit more opaque than we wished, but we got it as close as we could. And one of the things that was a real triumph, unfortunately, not many people picked it up, was the glow in the dark sheets. Wow. Do those glow in the dark? Boy,
I have mine, and I haven't used it for a session yet. I've been trying to figure out what it is, but it surprises me every once in a while, because I'll be looking in the corner of my game room or something when all the lights are out at night, and it's like, oh,
there's something radioactive in the corner.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've said that they look exactly like the glowing fuel rod that Homer Simpson has go down the back of his shirt at the start of the show. It's just ridiculously glowy.
But yeah, great products. So definitely something I was happy to pick up, and yeah, they will last forever. I've taken good care of my old Nagahide mat, but no matter how well you take care of them, they pick up stains, they get worn out, and they're just an outdated technology.
Yeah, we can do better. And hopefully, I mean, I'm not the only person who's produced silicon sheets. There's another company, but they tend to run out of stock a lot. We have additional stock now, and you can buy the Big Pockets products on the D&D WoW website, so you can pick them up there. We have some stock, and we're also going to be producing another run of them in the future.
Oh, great!
So yeah, so it is an ongoing concern. It's largely out of my hands and handed over to D&D WoW, who were my partners through the Kickstarter and organizing. The agent over there that I was working with, May, was doing a lot of the dealing with the manufacturers and things like that, because obviously she speaks Mandarin Chinese and I do not. And I was helping her out with producing all of the English copy for the packaging on their dice products and helping them design dice.
It can be surprisingly difficult at times. I know this from my past work with the marketing agency and some of the clients we had to deal with in South Korea and China. And it's not like what people think, like, miscommunication or language issues. I mean, there's a little bit of that, but sometimes there's weird cultural differences that you don't expect. Like the spelling of therapy was one that came up a lot. It's spelled therapy in a lot of places in South Asia. I don't know why. And this is something, I mean, it's common in the Philippines too, but we had to really argue with them about it, because they're like, no, that's how you spell it. I was like, look, and they were trying to market specifically to the US and English speaking countries. So we're like, look, if you're going to like market to English speakers, you have to use the word therapy.
Right, right.
And like you have to phrase things differently because it comes off as a it's like almost like that uncanny valley type effect,
Hmm.
but through language. So
Yeah. That's like the same with me using cookies rather than saying biscuits because
oh
it
yeah,
means something different to Americans. Mm.
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so the other thing I produced is unique dice. I've got two sets of dice now, which have been produced through Bestcon Dice Company, and that's another product that I thought must exist somewhere, and I found that it didn't. So I got Bestcon to produce them from my designs, and surprisingly, they've actually sold pretty well.
Oh,
So that's good.
I don't know if I'm familiar with your dice.
Little pots and little fires all over the place. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, tell me about your dice, because my wife she took up one of her many COVID hobbies, which was she took up dice making at home. But I'm curious about the dice you've made. Do they bounce?
So these are not silicon dice. These are regular dice. It's the actual designs of the dice themselves. They're not number dice. They are specialist dice. So I've got a directional D8, which gives you all the cardinal directions on a compass.
Mm.
I've got an emotion dice, which is a 12-sider because there's 12 different cardinal emotional states, which are represented by different emojis. I've got a weather dice. It's a D10 with different weather conditions and temperature fluctuations. I've got the random terrain dice for a hex crawl. I've got the dungeon design dice and the dungeon features dice, and also the treasure picker dice. So your different options for D8. So you've got a weapon, jewels, wondrous items, scrolls, that sort of thing. So you can
Oh,
roll. You can basically completely randomly generate an adventure and the starting emotional state of an NPC through these dice. Yeah,
wow!
I thought, why don't those exist?
I
So
remember some of those just as like one-offs that like maybe Chessex might have every once in a while,
mm,
or was like something you could pick up at a con. But yeah,
yeah,
uh,
never a complete set of them that you can add and have that truly complete weird set of dice that every DM secretly wants. They want to pull out that magical dice that nobody else has got at that table, and I
yeah.
thought that's exactly what I want to
Mm-hmm.
build.
Yeah, I have a few old dice like that are just that I save either, original D&D like dice from the 70s or,
Hmm.
some of the first metal dice. I have one that was a D10 that shattered when I rolled it on a critical like a very important roll during a game of back when
Oh
I was a
wow.
teenager, and, the die, it landed face up, but it split with like a third of it just like sloughing off, and it literally exploded. If you rolled a 10 on the D10, it exploded in that system. So yeah, I'm I'm very much a skeptic, but there's a part of me that believes that die is magic.
Yeah, yeah, true. So the reason why I got originally involved with May and D&D WoW is because of helping them out with English translation, but also we designed basically a premium, which was a glow. It's a mood dice, so it changes color as you hold it in your hand, and your body temperature makes it shift from an amber all the way through to a deep blue color.
Ooh.
So and it's got rounded beveled edges so that it's not sharp. Even the D4s, particularly the D4s. People who make
Oof.
metal D4s out there, be aware you're producing things which can maim children. Okay, so bevel the goddamn points on those dice, please. Anyway, so we set about making premium metal dice, not just gimmicky weird things. Well, I mean it's fairly gimmicky, and we've got glow in the dark dice and things like that. But yeah, that's probably one of the most plush looking D20 dice that you'll ever pick up. That's not made out of meteorite or dinosaur bone or something else ridiculous.
Ooh, yeah. Like on paper, I always say like, oh, you don't like who needs super fancy dice made out of something like a meteor or a mammoth tusk or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But then I see those pop up on like a Kickstarter or something, and I just like, oh, the shiny.
Yeah, the addict in you comes out and it's like must have.
Mm-hmm. Well, I am gonna.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in all the like the random generation dice that I'm gonna have to take a look at those and see if Flourish knows about those, because that's
Right.
exactly up his alley. With he's very much a proponent of doing the least amount of work and getting the most results from it as far as the what you do for your game.
Oh,
So
absolutely. I just picked up, I've got my hard copies right here in front of me of Sly Forest's Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, fantastic adventures and fantastic locations. Those are on my reading list right now. So they're literally in my hands. I'm about to dive into them.
yeah, absolutely fantastic books. I keep referencing them again and again. I'm a new
Yeah.
like devotee. So yeah, anyone
Oh,
listening, you
I
should
have been a
totally simp for
subscriber
Sly.
to, yeah, I've been a subscriber to John Ford's newsletters, RPG newsletter things for ages. This guy, if you want a content creator that is top tier, John Ford, who's now associated with Sly Flourish and some of the new products, absolutely legend, this guy.
Oh, I will have to check
Legend.
him out. I think I've seen him on other shows, but I don't think I've watched any of his direct content. The name is familiar, but I will have to look that up.
He's literally been producing a newsletter for years, probably over a decade now. And that is just solid DMing advice. This guy honestly will have, like me, I've forgotten things that I put out in my videos. I've forgotten more monster lore than some people even know. Yeah. So
Oh, I
yeah.
guarantee you've forgotten more monster lore than most people know. I mean, it's a sad fact that the number of people that have read through the player's handbook and play D&D is smaller than the number of people who have not read through the player's handbook and play D&D. And
True.
to be fair, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, as
Yeah.
long as people are enjoying the game, that's great.
Oh, absolutely. I've got
Yeah.
no problem with people who watch my videos who have never played D&D, who have no intention of playing D&D. They're just there because it's fantasy content that they're absorbing. And that's why I've shifted more lately over to producing more story-based content and less stat-based content. Like, so for example, the last video that I produced on the Allmere, the second edition sort of Jabba the Hutt monsters, there's no stats on there. What I just talk about their attacks and things like that, but I don't talk about what their strength score or hit points and things are, because it's not really important. You can find
Right.
conversions and things of that online pretty easily.
Yeah, numbers are easy enough to generate, especially in this day and age where they literally just tell you, like, if it's supposed to be this CR, these are the stats that you can give it. So,
Yeah. So
it's
unfortunately, it might hurt my audience of people who listen to my videos to fall asleep at night, because those stat blocks will definitely 100% knock you out. But yeah,
yeah.
I find them a bit dull myself.
So, when did gaming come into the mix for you? Was it something that started right after you started playing with action figures? Like, I know for my friends and I, it was playing with action figures and literally playing role-playing games and adventures with them without even realizing it that led to D&D.
It's like Dungeons and Dragons. You don't find it, it finds you. So here I am, far, far away in the distant mystical land of New Zealand, a young man in the 1980s. And I've got my hands on through sort of the book club, where you can select these books and your parents pay the money and they deliver them to you, and these books that you own yourself. That was how I read Voyage of the Dawn Treader was my first fantasy novel that I read, C.S. Lewis, and I got The Wizard of the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, a choose your own adventure book.
Oh.
And I devoured that, and I still have it right here. So Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone are, I think, as important to the realm of role-playing games as Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson are, because they
yes.
And absolutely, they were there. They were like part of the founding fathers of the D&D, and far more important, I think, than people really know, because not only were they the generators of Warhammer Fantasy and the Warhammer 40k war games and role-playing games, but they were also partners of Dave and Gary right in the beginning, and they were sort of the UK arm of Dungeons and Dragons. That's where the Fiend Folio comes from. Was their contribution through White Dwarf magazine and things like that.
Exactly.
So they were originally going to be producing the miniatures for Dungeons and Dragons through their company, the Games Workshop. But in the last minute, for whatever reason, Gary and Dave went with somebody else, and so they branched off and made their own company. So if fate was slightly different, Warhammer 40k would be part of the D&D franchise.
And
imagine
imagine what a juggernaut that would have been. Though, I mean, just for like context, I know that one of the early things that Steve Jackson was involved in was the Space Gamer magazine, which was out in the 70s. That predated even D&D. It mostly talked about war games and board games and stuff. but that was how, I mean, first, that was how Janelle Jacquet got introduced to D&D, was the review of D&D that was in The Space Gamer. And Steve Jackson eventually like bought the magazine itself and kept publishing it. But that would, and that's something you don't hear about all the time. We all hear about chainmail and the early, the white box set and stuff and the early pamphlets. But there was this whole gaming scene that was happening around there that it was just like percolating. And I mean, all these greats come out. Kevin Simbita too, who of course got involved with like the Judges Guild, and it was that same group of gamers that was inspired, that got in part introduced to D&D by the Space Gamer, that went on to start the Judges Guild and put out some of the legendary products from there, like the Dark Tower and Caverns of Thracia and the City of the Invincible Overlord.
Kevin Simbita has been a bastion of role-playing games for a very long time, and he's maintained control over his IP, and the Palladium Books company has been going strong for many years through trials and tribulations and things. And really, I mean, these days I pick up his books from like Beyond the Supernatural. I was reading Nightspawn or Nightbane the other day. I'm just sort of starting to pick that up and get back into Palladium Books again. And just the writing in those books is so iconic and so like it's like a fresh idea pouring off the page, and the concepts and things in these books, like Beyond the Supernatural, is just fantastic. It's like a light Call of Cthulhu sort of game where you play. We're a modern world where the supernatural is real. It's like the conspiracy is true. There really are ley lines, and Stonehenge really is a place where portals open once a year, sort of thing. And there are these hidden societies of sorcerers and things like that. It's the sort of thing that movies like have this pseudo mystical aspect to them and things. And I've run some really good Beyond the Supernatural games. And because it's Palladium is a megaversal rule system, one of the first generic rule systems, you can combine all these things. So I play a game where superheroes, mutant animals, supernatural terrors, mystical martial artists and things are all real and interacting, and you can go off-world, and then you're into phase world space and just take trips over to different dimensions. They've got rules for time travel, and it's all seamlessly tied together. And I've been a big devotee of Palladium games back when I started playing role-playing games. If we get back to like the origin story, because they were fairly rare and expensive, and we were just teenagers who didn't have a huge budget, and they were also very hard to get hold of because they brought over container loads of D&D role-playing products, and it was a grab bag of different things, and you would get like one or two source books of something, and possibly not the main book, or you would get the main book and then nothing else. So we were lucky to get a collection of things, and it wasn't possible for us to just order things from overseas and get them delivered via Amazon or things. Those things just didn't exist back then,
right?
So yeah, and so our thing was each of us would buy a certain product, and became our game that we would run for other people. So in the beginning, I wasn't a dungeon master of Dungeons and Dragons. I was a player of Dungeons and Dragons for years and years. All through second edition, I didn't DM the game. I just played the game. I barely even knew half the rules of the game. I just knew enough to play the characters and focus on my role playing and stuff, and roll the dice that I was asked to roll, sort of thing. But when it came to Palladium Books, Beyond the Supernatural, Heroes Unlimited, Ninjas and Super Spies, and eventually Rifts, Phase World, Wormwood, all the massive collection of books that Palladium has produced.
Robotech, that was one of my first introductions to Palladium.
Right. Yeah. The Mechanoids. Yep. That was all my bag. So that was when it was time for me to DM, I would run Palladium. It was usually Heroes Unlimited combined with Ninjas and Super Spies. That was our main jam. And so that's why I ended up knowing so much about modern firearms and stuff, because you ended up with these superheroes that were absolutely loaded with weapons. Yeah. Those games, we didn't really have campaigns. We had murder sessions, and you'd roll up a character in the sort of weekend, and then we'd get together and we'd play those characters for a couple of games. It was a rare thing where a character would last for more than like 10 sessions or so, but it was usually like a real favorite character of those players, like Super Bunny, a vigilante that was bunny themed. So he had a bazooka that fired and things. Like he had projectile carrots that would lock onto the nipples and twist. Hydraulically twist the nipples of a character.
And since we're since we're talking
Yeah.
about Palladium games, I'm sure that there was rules for all of that.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah, here's the nipple
We
twister rockets. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So my friend JP, he ran Traveller, and so we played almost as much Traveller as we played D&D, and that was usually devolved into shotguns and flak jackets in a spaceport hotel room, occasionally spilling out into a car park, and then a car chase in some sort of hover vehicle or something through some city. I don't know if we ever really any mysteries or alien artifacts or anything like that. It was usually just the client has a job for you, deliver this to here, and then we get into a gunfight with a bunch of goons, and that was what we loved to do as teenagers. We just And my friend Max, that was D&D. Max and Ashley were the D&D DMs, and that was second edition AD&D. I ran, I think, one or two D&D basic games, and so the full set of basic books were mine, but I never really ran those games, but I had a grounding in that. And so when it came to eventually getting back into D&D later on, I started DMing around 3.5 edition.
Oh, okay. Man, that is quite the leap from second edition to 3.5, unless, I don't know, did you ever play around with any of the player's option stuff from second edition?
No, not really, but we just didn't have access to it. Like we didn't have a battle system or anything like that. It just wasn't around. So we had the basic, but we had the three core books. We had Unearthed Arcana, and I think we had Castle Greyhawk, the sort of slapstick version of Castle Greyhawk.
Man, yeah, that was it. I was just a nuts adventure. Like,
somebody just sent me the PDF of that from Drive Through RPG, and I just started rereading it, and the nostalgia. It's like, this is the book that let me know that it was okay for D&D to be slapstick, for it to be funny, and it was vitally important, I think, to inject humor into Dungeons and Dragons, because that was what we desperately needed as teenagers, was just to cut back and have fun.
Oh yeah, I mean that was also one of the early adventures that like my friends and I got. I mean, we started with just a monster manual and having to try and make up rules to go with the stats in it. But I distinctly remember that there's a cow in the Castle Greyhawk adventure that takes off a character's helmet. It's a talking cow, and and if the characters don't stop it, it pulls a Tarrasque out of their helmet. Like a rabbit out of a hat. And if you don't stop it, it does it like a D3 rounds later.
Yep. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Tarrasque is, think of the Rancor from Star Wars, that big monster that Luke Skywalker has to fight with a thigh bone. That's pretty much what a Tarrasque
exactly. It's somewhere between a Rancor and Godzilla. And there's also, you could also meet the adventure writer in the Castle Greyhawk adventure. Yeah. And he can write you out of existence if you annoyed him. Oh,
like welcome to the fourth wall. That's now, it's on the table.
So how much, like those early days, I think a lot of us who experienced those earlier days of RPGs, just those earlier RPGs, have similar experiences where it wasn't as common to have the long form campaign as kind of like the big story as the kind of the standard that it is now, especially with the dominance of 5e. And how much of that do you think is from the way the systems were designed then, the incentives that were present? Like before Milestone XP and D&D, you got XP, and in earlier editions of D&D before 3rd edition, one of the main ways you could get XP wasn't just killing monsters, even more than killing monsters, it was getting gold. And even if
it's impossible for me to give you an answer to that because I don't have any comparison. Like, so my changing of the way that I play the game coincides with me growing older and playing the game in a different way. And not only that, but that's also coincides with the game its evolution over time. So, for instance, when we started playing, we didn't have like 3.5 edition Savage Species where we had level adjustment for monsters that you wanted to play as player characters. So when I wanted to play a troll fighter, I had a level adjustment, so it took me longer to go up in level compared to the other players in the group who were playing more traditional player character races and things. And so that necessitates a campaign where that character has to play multiple adventures to go up in level to sort of, have that character development that I wanted them to have. And it was very interesting. Like we had characters that were of different levels in the same group. And quite often we had multiple characters that we were playing in the same group. So, I would be in charge of two different characters. And these days, that seems to be almost unheard of. So the modern players of 5th edition just are not used to the idea of the fact that you can have player characters in the group who are of different level, and you can have people who are playing more than one character. If you're playing something like Dungeon Crawl Classics or Lamentations of the Flame Princess or something like that, that's still part of the normal way that you would play the game. You start off with multiple characters, and whoever survives ends up being the character that you play with.
Or even Hackmaster is a game system that I've been a fan of for a long time, and actually kind of started the OSR like revolution that we saw in the 2000s. But one of the things, like, they have a protege system built in there, and there used to be stuff like that in the old, in like, first edition and like BXD&D, but they really like went into it where you're straight up, like, the idea was like sometimes you're going to need to heal for a couple months, or your character's just going to die, and if you don't want to come in at first level, you have to invest it in having like a roster of characters ready to step forward or replace you at times.
Right. Yeah.
But it's
and that's fine, because brawling up characters is a hobby in and of itself, just like world building is a hobby in and of itself that dungeon masters play by themselves. That's the solo game of D&D, really, is world building, if you ask me.
Yeah. Well, but I think that change too does kind of speak to the change in the game system as well. I mean, you have bounded accuracy in D&D. That action economy is so much more finely tuned than it used to be, and I think every DM has seen how, like, if you lose control of the action economy, either way, you either end up getting steamrolled by your players, or you end up steamrolling them more than anything else. And so
it becomes
the idea
adversarial.
Well, and not even just the adversarial part, but just, it is a slippery slope. Once you have, like, once your monsters have more actions per round than the players, and that's starting to get them an edge, when that starts wearing away at them, all it takes is one character going down, or, having to spend a couple rounds in a row just like healing instead of acting, and then they all start dropping like flies because the action economy just keeps getting worse and worse. And I think that's one of the big, like, why it's so hard to balance CRs in 5e still, despite the system being so well developed in many other ways. And I think that
I don't have a lot of faith in the CR system itself. I never really have. It's as simulationist as the rest of D&D is, so it's pretty rough. It's as realistic as the armor class system is. Really, it's representational of the real threat, but you can't account for every single situation. I mean, the environment that the encounter is taking place in is as much a factor as the monster's hit points or how many attacks per round it has. If all of a sudden it's activating swinging traps, or it's releasing trapdoors and new monsters are popping into the middle of the fight, it's a dynamic situation. That's the whole point. CR kind of it tries to stabilize something which I don't think should be stabilized. I think combat should be dynamic. I think you should be adjusting things on the fly as you go. Monsters should have variable hit points depending on how healthy or old, or how motivated they are and things. I mean, a lot of hit points is not how much damage you can take, it's your stamina. So it should have an emotional aspect to it as well. Like a healing from a cleric is not necessarily them stitching your wounds back together. It may just be them, giving you a pot of coffee. It's your cardio more than anything. Nobody gets better at getting stabbed in the guts with a sword. That's going to kill you every time.
Right. Well,
your hit points represent your being able to avoid getting stabbed in the guts with a sword.
Right. And I think we a lot of us, especially because of the prevalence of video games and stuff too, have gotten used to the idea of like hit points being literal like stab wounds and injuries, and healing is just this like super magic that's healing you up. And even the original like concept of them was what you were describing. It's more about your will to fight and your stamina and just your ability to keep kind of acting like that. I remember, I think it was it was James Ward, I think. One of the things I remember is they broke down a duel in Game of Thrones as like how that would be represented in D&D, in like OD&D combat, and how there were all these times where he's like saying, oh, they lost hit points here. He hit and he did damage even though he didn't stab the other guy. but was
Right.
noting how he got an advantage, or he forced him back, or winded him, or caused an
Hmm.
expenditure of will and effort. And,
Yeah.
so there was always that concept that, this was not you get stabbed in the gut and then the cleric's magically healing you. It's more of a,
Right.
you
You get
know,
knocked prone. You get knocked
yeah.
prone, and the guy is on you, and he's like, he's choking you out. You're not necessarily, bleeding to death or anything, but you're certainly losing hit points because whoever gets gassed first in an MMA fight or a boxing match or something like that is the one who's going to lose.
Mm-hmm. It's something one of the games that I've been a fan of for a while is Trudvang, and while it works on an old the Drakkar und Demonar system from like the 90s, they recently updated it for 5e,
Man,
and
I thought I knew some obscure games. You got me, you got me beat.
It's the number one game in Sweden. What? So, but one of the things they have is wound states, and it basically works like
Right.
the exhaustion levels in D&D, and they did the same thing with fear, and I thought that was really great, and it adds
Mm.
in, so even if you take, like, if you have a lot of hit points, you can still end up getting, just by having your wound states go down a lot, you can end up getting, like, severely incapacitated just because, you got spent, or
Hmm.
took debilitating, injuries over the course, or setbacks over the course of this. And there are like leadership abilities that allow people to heal. So by giving encouragement, you can move your wound state up. I thought it was a really
I could
interesting.
quite honestly see Dungeons and Dragons moving that way through 6th or 7th edition for sure, getting more and more narrative based and less rules and stat based
I
because it just makes more sense to me that way.
Yeah, I know that's where Matt Colville has been moving with some of the rules that he puts out for 5e as well, like in Kingdoms and Warfare and Strongholds and Followers. The followers in there, the NPCs, rather than giving them hit points that you're having to track as well, they could just take a number of hits, and
Mm,
didn't matter how, like, you could say that like a critical hit count is 2 or something, but it was basically something like they just have this many number of hits, and it's way easier to handle that way. And
yeah. I
yeah.
can see in future, mark my words on this one. This is my prediction that people are going to be talking about this next iteration of Dungeons and Dragons as 5.5. They're not going to be calling it 6th edition.
Right.
Because it is they're so worried about the backwards compatibility issue. Because really, all they're trying to do is organize the stat blocks better and bring it more in line with all the errata and stuff that is built up over the Gazetta style rule books that we've had for 5th
Hmm.
edition. It's very spread out, so they don't want us to have to buy Mordenkainen's. Well, they would like us to buy Mordenkainen's and Volos and all these things, Tashes and all these different source books. But really, what they're doing is they're producing this compendium of material, so it's all found in one place that they can sell as a three
Hmm.
book set.
Just like happened in
For
4th edition.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So instead of producing Monster Manual 2, which they really you would think they would have produced a second Monster Manual by now, but what they've been doing is spreading it out through all these different Gazetta style books.
Yeah.
So there's a grab bag of different materials to appeal to the widest supply, interests. But it is a problem because you end up with this loaded bookshelf, or the idea of carting these books along to places. Really, what most people do these days, of course, is take along PDFs and load them up on their
Exactly.
laptop or tablet.
Well, and
Yeah,
it helps them push D&D Beyond.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
D&D Beyond it's been interesting. Like 4th edition, in many ways, had a superior computer support system. Like the electronic support arm of 4th edition was far better than 5th edition started out. Started out very sketchy with 5th edition. They promised a
Hmm.
lot, they didn't deliver. They didn't deliver a character builder that they said they were going to deliver. The company that was originally contracted to do that went crazy and had very strange ideas and seemed to have, I don't know, some sort of a megalomaniac at the helm who decided to dictate what the terms were going to be to Wizards of the Coast, and they said no. And so they ended up going with basically a Twitch oriented company.
Yeah.
And so it's been so heavily focused on Twitch. As a YouTuber, I've felt very much left out in the cold, and YouTube content creators have always felt like second class citizens compared to, like, if I was a Twitch streamer, it would be very easy to integrate with D&D Beyond and get all sorts of promotional materials and things like that. But yeah, just no. And it's been focused that way with live play and things like that. And they seem to think that, Twitch as a gaming channel must be the vehicle that Dungeons and Dragons takes place on. But you can do everything that you do on Twitch on YouTube.
Uh,
And YouTube has got a far bigger audience,
mm.
really, when you think about it.
I know a lot of people have been shifting their focus, the people in the streaming scene, besides you, have been shifting their focus from Twitch to either YouTube or in some cases Facebook. Some of them had way more success with Facebook videos
Yeah.
than they did and live streams than they ever did with Twitch. No,
Follow me, my friends. I will show you the way.
and I know purely from having done marketing for gaming for a number of different like gaming publishers that it is really hard to track Twitch traffic, and that was like always a
Mm,
big issue because being able to determine like if you wanted to sponsor a Twitch channel, it was hard to find out like well what's the return that we're getting on this, like even just how many
mm.
people are coming here from this Twitch show. I don't know what it is about it that made it really difficult to be able to get good data for that.
Yeah.
But you don't
The
have that.
deceptive thing about Twitch is that the gaming channels on Twitch have a much, like, if you compare them to the specific gaming traffic on YouTube, so you're cutting it down to one specific category. So that's specific videos that are tagged as gaming. For
Mhm.
instance, I don't tag my videos as gaming. They're educational videos. So I'm in an entirely different category from a lot of people who produce YouTube content because I'm producing information about literature. It is
Right.
literally educational. Maybe if I was doing live streaming of games and things like that, I'd be in a gaming slice of YouTube. But when you compare Twitch to specifically gaming on YouTube, they seem similar in the audience sizes, but it's very, very deceptive because you're only taking a tiny slice of the YouTube audience pie and comparing it to the totality of Twitch. Really, there's no comparison. When I live
Oh,
stream, I have
absolutely.
a couple of hundred people who are in there watching me, draw a
Mhm.
map or something like that. That would be a huge audience for a Twitch channel. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, most Twitch gaming channels, unless it's Critical Role, it's hard for them to post the kind of numbers that say that you regularly get on YouTube, and
Mm.
then like in the post views, it's just like nothing close to that.
Yeah,
Uh,
and like the searchability on Twitch is absolutely dreadful. Finding content is dreadful. It's just it's a nightmare platform. I don't know why people use it. No offense, Twitch, but geez,
yeah, I think
by the
they
by
were
the skin of your
there.
teeth, you're hanging on.
Yeah, they were there when the iron was hot.
Yeah,
When streaming gaming was becoming a thing, they were the first like service that was good enough at the time that everyone went that that's why everyone went with it. I know the only reason I
yeah,
signed up for Twitch at all was to use D&D Beyond, and that was like how my awareness of it would like
exactly.
grew and
I'm
came
exactly the same. Yeah, that's the only reason why I have a Twitch account. So
hmm
D&D Beyond, excuse me, D&D Beyond, could you actually like move away from Twitch, please? That would be nice.
right. I feel like Roll20 is in much the same position now. They were the right
Mm,
play, like the right product at the right time, and they weren't perfect, but they did the job better than anything else that was out when they first started to
yeah,
become big, both like with fifth edition and as streaming was rising, and then even more so obviously when the COVID pandemic hit and everyone was switching to
yeah.
VTT gaming. But you hear about Foundry, VTT more and more now, and of course, Fantasy Grounds has always been around. Though I feel they also struggle with relevance and modernity a lot now too. But there's a lot of great VTT options available, or even just running it through
Well, we're on the
Discord.
cusp of the next evolution of VTT is going to be absolutely huge, and that's my kit from, what are they called? Tilt 5 or
Oh
Tilt 5?
yes.
Yeah. So that's arriving soon. And okay, so those of you who are not familiar, cast your mind back to the Star Wars scene where Luke and Chewbacca and things are playing that little board game with the holographic pieces, little monsters that are moving around and killing each other on the thing.
The
That
Dejarik
is
board.
what Yeah, that is what Tilt 5 is like. So you've got a pair of glasses that you put on that is projecting the image in 3D of what's on that game surface in front of you. Nobody else around you can see what you see, and it's basically beaming it right into your eyes. So it's in high clarity, and it's got perfect motion tracking with these little wands and things that you can move. So you can literally play that game with anybody around the world who's got the system themselves. So you can see that VTT is now going to just leap into this augmented reality
Mm-hmm.
perfectly. And there's a lot of companies which are lining up and producing content like War Tiles and various other
Yeah.
companies which are
Uh,
producing content for this as we speak. It's the next platform that is going to just absolutely take over everything.
yeah. I
So
mean,
I'm very much looking forward to D&D modules and things being built around this.
Yeah, I mean, more and more including assets with modules and like is not only a way to increase the like perceived value to customers for digital products, because I think an ongoing issue is that like customers in general just don't value PDFs the way that they
Mm,
value books. Just,
yep.
there's not the same production cost as far as actually like printing and shipping them, but I think the industry, or rather the customer base as a whole, tends to undervalue the work of all the creatives that go into digital products. And I
Yeah.
think that these types of 3D assets, the things that, and even just good VTT assets and VTT ready assets, are something that really helps create that sense of value and makes people feel more okay to transitioning to paying like good money for primarily digital products, which I think is where the
Yeah.
gaming industry has to head. I
Not
mean,
only that, but I think PDFs are badly let down on the mentality of the people who are producing them to not embrace multimedia to its full extent. So, for instance, with a PDF, you're basically producing a digital version of a book, but you can include in there hot links to multimedia content.
hmm
So you can have a PDF that you click on a link and it's opening up in a separate window that has got a soundtrack that's going with that particular encounter scene that you're on, like using Sirenscape or something like that. You can integrate those things perfectly. Sirenscape produces bespoke soundscapes for adventures, for Pathfinder and things like that. You can produce YouTube videos and things which outlay and tutor the beginner DM in how to run that encounter that is
hmm
far faster for them to pick up and learn how to play a game, because you've given them a concrete example that they can just click on the tutorial to run through this encounter before you start running this for your friends at home, sort of thing. These sort of things should be more standard in the industry. A little bit more effort, a little bit more creativity, a little more collaboration between writers, video producers, sound producers, and things like that to actually produce a full multimedia experience that will really immerse people in the game and get them very hooked into it, because that's what kids these days are capable of absorbing, and that's the sort of thing they should expect from digital
hmm
products. That's why these things would have added value that is beyond the hardcover books and things. So you if you had that full and complete, it includes a VTD map, it includes this thing already set up for you on Roll20, so you don't have to do all this background programming and clicking all these boxes and watching tutorial videos and things like that. It's difficult to use these platforms because they haven't fully embraced the technology which is available to them right now, and that has been available for the last 6 years or so. So they need to get their fingers out of their asses. I was just talking to my friend about my concept of a choose your own adventure, where you make a series of YouTube videos which
hmm
are, at the end of the video, you get the decision, like a choose your own adventure book.
hmm Well, I mean, that's
um,
Black Mirror
and it takes you
Bandersnatch or something like that, right?
Yeah, and it takes you to the next video and the next video and the next video. And multiple content producers could create individual segments of this choose your own adventure, and even completely change it around internally and keep it fresh and innovative and interesting. So you could have this massive sprawling adventure where you basically click on the first video, and then for every decision you make, it takes you on this journey through all these different videos, which have got a decision at the end of it. And it just you could be
Huh.
totally immersed in a interactive YouTube video that spans across multiple different content creators, all of them earning revenue from this steady stream of people playing this game. It
Hmm.
would be fantastic.
Yeah, I wonder, it'd be interesting to try that out with just like one of the old choose your own adventure books and just
Yeah.
find some content creators to do it as an experiment and see how people
Not only
respond. I
that, but
think that
there's now software that plans out the whole thing for you. It basically just has all the decision trees mapped out for you. You can just click on one; it will give you an if and when sort of option, and you can do it page by page by page by page by page and plan it out very easily. That
hmm
software exists as apps and things. And yeah, and if you spread it out over multiple content creators, they don't have to do all the work themselves. They can, and plus the person has this interesting experience of going from one style of video producer to another, sort of thing.
right?
Yeah, an
Absolutely.
example of
People
this was a CD that was put out for Star Trek, where it was Learn Klingon, and it was an interactive thing. That guy that does the Garon figure with the googly eyes and stuff, and yeah, they give you these decisions at the end of it. It's like, do you accept the gift, or do you accept this insult that he's given to your thing? And yeah, it was really good.
Yeah,
And
man. I could see like you could get, special guests and have them just record one little like a hard to find like, well, you have to take this decision and this decision if you want to get this video that leads to this, that has, whoever, I don't know, like Greenwood or somebody.
The sky's the limit, really. We've got
Hmm.
so many tools at our disposal. We just need to learn how to use them and have the willingness to put in the effort to add that value to the products that we produce. And then we could really say, hey, look, pay a fair price for the amount of work that's, and people would recognize, yeah, this is pretty awesome. This is something that a notebook could do, you know.
Hmm.
But
I think
PDFs right now, it's just a digital copy of a book. Maybe it's got some hot links in there that take you to pages from a menu, but really there's not a lot of effort that goes into some of these things.
Yeah, I've seen some, I mean, and it does tend to be from newer companies and it's newer products, but I've seen some that do like will hot link to videos or sites in there. But it definitely there's a lot more that could be done with this. I completely agree there. I do think that part of it is I think there are people who want to do these things and explore them, but it's again like that valuation issue is not only comes from the bottom from the customer base, but also comes from the top where we
Mm.
know that like the kind of the large the big moneyed interests in gaming, the big publishers don't like to take a lot of risk and they don't like to
Hmm.
pay a lot of money because traditionally they didn't have to pay gaming creatives a lot of money, and why would they pay any more than they have to?
It
And
really takes somebody like I'm in a position where I'm earning a good income from the content that I produce on a regular basis, and I I've earned my dues. I've done it the long way, and I'm in a position where I can support other creatives and things like that and do projects like this and actually pay artists and things to do stuff like that. So, and because I'm completely independent of any gaming company, I'm not beholden to anyone. I
mhm.
could produce something like this and it would take a while because I'm just one guy sort of thing. But yeah, if I can
Eh,
spread the idea to enough people, maybe somebody will rally
yeah,
to the
spread that
cry.
viral meme and the
Yeah.
classic selfish Gene Dawkins sense.
Yeah, if
Uh,
I shout it into the void, eventually the void would shout back.
that's how The Secret worked, right? Yeah, back when that was the popular self-help book. Though,
Spoilers.
though it is, it's interesting. I guess like touching on that topic because like I know that independence is something that's been like just in the gaming news recently because Critical Role has their new animated series that's about to come out. They funded
Right.
that with a groundbreaking Kickstarter that
Yep.
broke a bunch of records, but Amazon picked them up for an extra season, and now like when they'd originally promised that everyone all backers are going to have access to season 1, now you have to get an Amazon Prime membership to be able to see any of the seasons of this. And they sent out an email to all the backers explaining here's how you sign up for a free Amazon Prime trial if you haven't already done one within the past 12 months. Otherwise,
Ooh.
literally like telling people, "Oh, you're going to have to make a new email address so that you can register for like the free week of Amazon Prime to be able to watch the first season." And
Yeah. I'm sweating for them. I'm
right?
sweating for them.
It's
Ouch.
easy to see like how that decision came about. Amazon
Yeah.
wanted to pick up the show and obviously was saying like, "Hey, it's going to be like we pick this up, it's got to be hosted on our network." But, and but that was where their promise to their fans, their promise to their to their backers, was compromised because they
Yeah.
were became beholden to Amazon basically like, "Well, we
I
want that money."
wonder if that's behind these people they're all actors and stuff. They're thespians
Mhm.
and wanting to get into the acting industry, right? Is that their background, the Critical Role people?
Well, they're voice actors, so they're all very successful voice actors too. They've still been working as voice actors throughout like Critical Role's run. So, but a number of them have been in like major video games. One of them is the voice of Jaina from the Warcraft series, for instance. Yeah, yeah. So they're all very well established there, and they know this industry, and that's why it is a little surprising that it ended up happening. But again,
Mm,
like Critical Role has shown that like when there's been controversies that have come up revolving around WotC, even when there's a lot of outcry in the community, they always dance around it.
yeah.
They've made it clear that that their interests come first, and that's their prerogative. But when they've had to choose between their independence or answering to a moneyed interest that's investing in them, they tend to go with that muddied interest, whether it's not speaking out about the controversy around, say, like Mike Merles and all that, like
Mm-hmm.
mess over at Wizards of the Coast, or the complaints that came out of there from BIPOC writers and creators that weren't like getting their due, or were being
Still
just
aren't getting
like,
their
yeah,
due.
still aren't getting their due. They're making strides, but obviously they need to do a lot better. But
Sure
yeah,
do.
so it just illustrates how, I guess, how much of an influence that still has, and how, while it's, D&D has more, gaming in general has more acceptance now, there was kind of a deal with the devil that was made by getting this kind of widespread, I guess, marketing and support from multinationals like Hasbro.
Yeah.
Uh,
I keep
and
saying, I've been saying all along that as soon as we see D&D Barbie, we know it's gone mainstream. That's
mhm.
my litmus test.
Well, you know what? So Hasbro is just released their own, like, simplified, stripped down version of like 5e D20 that they're using for the GI Joe RPG that's like just about to get
Oh,
released, and Transformers and
well,
some
there you
other
go.
Hasbro properties. Yeah,
There you
it's
go.
started.
Fantastic. I'm like, yeah, like I may be very much old school and have come up from, the same neckbeardy path as most others who have been playing role-playing games for a very long time, but I'm totally on board with everything that's happening right now. I'm sitting back in glee. I just want everybody playing role-playing games. I think it's fantastic. I think it's socially dynamic. I think it's a great way to form friendships and relationships with people. It's one of the few things these days which really encourages face-to-face hanging out and regularly, communing with your friends. It builds really good friendships and things like that. So I think it's a 100% healthy educational activity that you can do.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah,
so yeah, anything that promotes Dungeons and Dragons to a wider audience is okay with me.
right. Yeah,
So
just because I was gonna say,
I'm
just
not
because
I'm
you go.
I don't care. Like, you can call something woke or something like that. I don't care, as long as it gets more asses on seats, as long as it brings in more people, as long as they feel more accepted and more able to play the game. That is
Exactly.
fine with me. Yeah,
Yeah, and
it's a
that's
very
like,
diverse hobby. It's a very, very diverse hobby.
yeah. I mean, and that's why, I mean, the stuff we're just talking about, that's not about saying, oh, we hate D&D or hate that it's gotten so big. It's just
Mm,
recognizing where it can be better, where it can
yeah,
be more, like, more welcoming and more open, because we've seen just how, not only, so the business success that's created for D&D is great. Don't get me wrong,
yeah,
but that's not why we should value it. It's just seeing
no,
the way it's grown the community and how many more people feel welcome in that community.
yeah,
Especially
yeah,
because, I mean, role playing for so many folks who don't feel like they fit into whatever their society's norm is has been a refuge for so many of us. Whatever your reason why you didn't feel like everyone else was, gaming was there.
yeah.
Uh,
I was just built for Dungeons and Dragons. It's part of my DNA. You cut me, I bleed. So
well, you live in
for
Middle
me, it's
Earth. I mean,
yeah, it's formed. It's the basis of my social circles. It's everybody I know plays role playing games. If you
mhm,
don't play role playing games, I find it hard to converse with you about normal day to day stuff. I'm very much, my alignment is lawful D20. So
mhm.
well, chaotic good role playing dungeon master.
Oh
Anyway,
yeah.
the thing with like the diversity of Dungeons and Dragons and things is that it's always been a moving and adapting and changing and shifting game that's becoming more and more streamlined. It has been becoming less restrictive and more streamlined ever
Mhm.
since the first editions of the game, where back in the day you couldn't play a character class unless you had attribute scores of this high, this much or higher. Well, they get
Mhm.
rid of these things, and there was a hue and an outcry back then, but like these days, people getting their knickers in a twist about adventurers and wheelchairs, things like that. They're like having a
Oh,
huge, like that being enough to split the
uh,
community along party lines and things. That's ridiculous. It's like
right.
nothing compared to the changes that have happened in the hobby
Right.
over our tenure of watching the game develop and grow. So yeah, these are nothing. These are nothing. These are teething problems
Right.
as we shift and grow and produce a better game. But
I remember.
the evolution of Dungeons and Dragons will never stop. There will never be a final edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Get that out of your head right away. Like, fifth edition has had a great run, but we're
Mhm.
ready to move on.
Right. Yeah. There's always room for improvement. And yeah, the hue and cry now, I mean, it was there back at the beginning of the game, just about women being even included as options as player characters.
Mhm.
And whether
Playing
dwarven
wizards.
women, yeah, playing, whether dwarven women had beards, that split the community, like ruined friendships.
Yeah, they do, by the way. And anybody who says they don't, well, you've never been there.
Yeah, that's something I've really like loved is that recently in the art for like a little bit for 5e and very much for Pathfinder, they have been really bringing back gorgeous beards on dwarven women. Yeah, so
Peter Jackson in Lord of the Rings movies, beards.
going like reaching back to those early days of your gaming, you published the Blade Mage in Rifter number
Oh, yeah.
23. Have you thought about updating that for 5e or another system?
No, simply because you can accomplish exactly the same sort of thing using fluff text and using the existing character classes, even the core character classes like the Eldritch Knight sort of thing is exactly that.
Well, so if you were going to submit a new archetype to Rifts, what would it be?
To Rifts, I probably wouldn't write for Rifts. I would be more interested in an integrated Heroes Unlimited and Nightbane crossover. So you had
for the Megaverse.
For the Megaverse. Well, therein runs my problem with the rules mechanics of Rifts and the mega damage capacity thing. I'm not very much a fan of the mega damage mechanics for Rifts. I like the STC system. I don't really want to go into the details of the way the game works, but how it works is when Rifts came about, they wanted high-tech, super advanced technology to be very overwhelming. So if you got hit by a mounted weapon nuke, like a huge big laser on a walking robot Titan thing, it would basically vaporize you. So either you had armor and protection that could protect you from mega damage, this whole new category of like, if you get hit by a howitzer, carrying a riot shield isn't going to save you, sort of thing. No amount of body armor is going to stop a Gauss rifle, firing a bullet which is traveling at Mach 2. It's going to punch straight through you and liquefy your insides. I understand this, but it made it pretty difficult when, in later editions of Rifts, the power creep started in so that you had a mega damaged like lighter, or you had a shirt that you would put on and it had like 2 mega damage because it's made out of space age materials, and all of a sudden it can stop a howitzer. You can hit this thing with a baseball bat all day and it won't dent it, sort of thing. And yeah, that became a problem. Supernatural creatures that could now tear open tank armor and things like that. Yeah, how is somebody who's just role playing a non super duper character going to withstand even a second of all of a sudden their character gets stripped of their armor through somebody casting a spell, and that's it, they're liquefied. So I've always stuck with the STC system, and I play a homebrew rule where 1 mega damage is actually represented by 10 STC. So I don't use mega damage. I just multiply everything by 10 and run it that way. So that's what. But this is kind of Palladium's undergoing a bit of a revolution, or about to undergo a bit of a revolution, because Kevin Simbeda is thinking about retiring, and he's passing on the mantle to a new creative director of the company, which I'm interested to see how that pans out. Wow. You got to take a lot of things that Kevin says with a grain of salt, because he likes to talk about the future plans that sometimes don't happen. So we'll see.
Yeah, I still remember for one of the anniversary issues of Dragon Magazine, they asked Gary Gygax, and it was like the early 2000s when he was still alive, about where he saw D&D going and like what the plan had been. And so I believe this was the year
he nailed the RPGA. He got the idea of the RPGA.
Oh, there were a lot of things he actually got pretty close to right, to be quite frank. But he was predicting that we were going to have like the D&D sequel movie or third movie. I think it was the sequel movie was supposed to be coming out this year with Bruce Willis Jr. starring in it. There are a few like that. There's also like a D&D theme park in there, but he thought that was going to happen, as we saw from the animated show.
Yeah.
So what is a game? We've talked about a lot of games that you love that. From back in the day that I'm sure folks haven't heard out. What is a game that you've really wanted to play but haven't gotten the opportunity to? Whether it's a new game or one from like earlier in your gaming journey.
I've never actually gotten to play cyberpunk games like Shadowrun, and I've never gotten to play Vampire the Masquerade.
Hmm.
Two pretty big games. Mind
Yeah.
you, I have played some very obscure games like Toon and Car Wars, and I've even played Mifrog. I've got Mifrog on my shelf, believe it or not, controversial as that
Mifrog.
is.
I'm not
Oh
familiar with
yeah,
that one, but Car
you would.
Wars I had tons of. I think I had every iteration of Car Wars, and Toon I got to
Oh,
play way back when too.
yeah, Spike, Mifrog's creator is a very, very controversial figure that who you'd probably cancel me just for having that book on my shelf, I swear to God. But the game itself is crunchy as hell. It's a Viking mythos game, very, very crunchy, rules crunchy game. But I've played it and it's got some real good feels to it. But yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
You
that's
should do
that's
you can research that one.
I'll have to look that one up. I am Trudvang, the game I mentioned earlier, is Viking themed. It's Swedish, but so go figure. But yeah, heavily like Viking and Norse mythology
Mm,
themed, and so
yeah.
it was a big part of the appeal of it for me. And super crunchy in the core system too. Like if you do
Mm.
not invest in the combat movement skill, then when combat breaks out, you just stand in place.
Call of Cthulhu is a very good game, and I've had lots of very good experiences with Call of Cthulhu, particularly over the last 10 years. And there's an explosion of different options for playing Call of Cthulhu. It's got a vibe to it that is, some games have got a particular vibe to them that I think is well represented by that particular rule set. Call of
Hmm.
Cthulhu is one of those ones where you know that your character is doomed from the outset. That's a given. It's how your character is going to go insane
Hmm.
or get eaten. That's the fun part. But it's inevitable. You can't help but go down the rabbit hole leading to your character's doom. That's why people play Call of Cthulhu. If you're not playing
Hmm.
it like that, you're not playing it right. But
Exactly.
for me, that's like a flavor of fast food that I don't want every single day.
Right.
That's that. D&D is a flavor that it's fairly bland and generic, and I can add my own spices to it. That's a meal that I can go to every day. That's like the food court.
Hmm.
Um, and other things, other settings for D&D are more sort of nuanced as well. Like Dark Sun, for instance, has got a particular vibe to it. Dragonlance has got a particular vibe to it. Forgotten Realms is more generic. I can add my own spices and flavor to it because it's incredibly rich and nuanced, and it's got all sorts of different settings that you can dive into that will deliver what you want. And that's one of the reasons why I like the Forgotten Realms so much. And I think it's right that it's the base setting for the fifth edition that most people have sort of had an introduction to.
Hmm.
However, everybody basically agrees that it has not been well serviced by fifth edition.
No.
We haven't got a core campaign book,
Yeah.
which no doubt would be a reprint of a lot of the information that was from second edition anyway. And also fourth edition was very badly handled and mangled a lot of the lore of fifth edition, and they seem completely unwilling to even accept the fact that that happened. And fifth edition has kind of pasted over all of those changes and kind of
Hmm.
retconned and put everything back to where it was, but it really hasn't acknowledged the fact that like they can't make a source book on Lurin because Lurin was underwater for 100 years. What's left? What is left of the place? Maybe they
Right.
did it because it was too complicated. I don't know, but they've concentrated very heavily on the Sword Coast. That's
Well,
true.
I think
And
they've. I think it's been a consistent effort, a conscious effort on their part to kind of destroy the idea that D&D is tied to a specific setting, even though.
I'm fine with that, but I mean,
Right.
if you're gonna do that, don't say that Forgotten Realms is the official
Right.
setting for fifth edition D&D. Just
Right.
say the official setting is the multiverse, because that's really what they wanted. They wanted
Yeah.
to introduce Magic the Gathering into Dungeons and Dragons, and
Well,
they've started to do that.
they
And
wanted. They wanted the Forgotten Realms IP because that was like to literally put that on there because the video games had all been Forgotten Realms
Mhm.
branded, the ones that people loved, and all the
Yeah,
Drizzt books, and
yeah,
those are the only ones that were still being printed. And then
yeah. Dark Alliance. Oh,
yeah, yeah, which you worked on the new Dark Alliance, you were the lore consultant for that,
yep, yep.
so
I
that's why
did a
all the
little bit of
lore.
write. I did a little bit of proxy writing, so they have a main writer who got all the credit for everything. But I did a lot of the lore that's on the tablets and things that you find. And the
Mhm.
idea was that there was a stone giant, a female stone giant scholar who was adventuring in the upper world. So for stone giants, the world above the underground is a dream. It's not really real. It's
Mhm.
like they're going walkabout in Australian outback sort of thing. So they
Yeah.
don't really trust anything that they see. And so she was writing all the lore and history of the day of the Icewind Dale region and things, and talking about the ancient times and things like that. So I was asked to write a lot of material about the ancient origin of the Orc tribes and things like that, and the Uthgarden barbarians and who the Rigid barbarians are and things like that. So included in that game was supposed to be some information about what Kelvin's Cairn actually is, and so it's a crash landed cloud city, cloud fortress of some giants. And Kelvin was a giant warlord who rampaged over the entire area on this mobile fortress and got so haughty and powerful that Tempest himself, the god Tempest, sent down an avatar and actually fought mano a mano against Kelvin. Obviously won, but had so much respect for Kelvin that he rained down meteors to create a burial ground, a mountain, Kelvin's Cairn, over top of this fortress. So if you dig into Kelvin's Cairn, you find this ruins of an upside down giant fortress that was supposed to be there. I don't know if it's actually in the game or not.
Huh. Yeah,
I never managed to play through the whole thing.
Because they added in the crashed Netherese flying city in the Rime of the Frost Maiden adventure, which takes place in Icewind Dale. And I know Eric Boyd had planted some stuff about that in the Forgotten Realms around, oh, God, the north of the Summer Hills. I'll remember it at some point. But yeah, like he had a whole other thing going on too. In the Evermoors, where there was like a crashed storm giant or cloud giant like flying ship. That was it. Like literally a giant flying boat that had a castle in the middle of it.
Right, yeah. And in the Great Swamp just beside Cormier, there's a glass dungeon sort of thing, which is some strange ruins in the middle of the swamp and things. There's all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah. So there you go, folks. That's why it's called the Forgotten Realms, because you can't throw a stone without hitting a lost kingdom. But that really is it. Like it's so rich, and I think they have done that lore a disservice with the way they have presented it, because like they wanted to cash in on that recognition that, and also older gamers like us are familiar with the realms and loved it. But then you see everything they released. The majority of the adventures have been reskinned Greyhawk adventures. Most of the major NPCs we're seeing mentioned, besides the Xanathar, are Greyhawk NPCs. And
Mordenkainen and Tasha and Fizzban from Dragonlance.
And there was a whole attempt in 3rd edition when they released it as well to cash in on Greyhawk again and to try and cash in on that nostalgia leading up to the release of 3rd edition D&D. They re-released a bunch of the old, like some of the original adventures, especially the ones that were specifically Greyhawk related for 2nd edition, and they did a new Greyhawk sort of gazetteer, though they couldn't really do it justice because all the right stuff was still, tied up with the Gygaxes at the time. And then 3rd edition, of course, Greyhawk was supposed to be the default setting, although they didn't provide any real info on it, just kind of like vague stuff referenced in the player's handbook, a lot like we've been getting now in 5e. It's surprising that they wanted to go that route again, because I don't think they've ever stuck that landing yet. And
no, I can see that, like, if you take a broad picture of what they've been doing with the lore from Magic the Gathering, so they've drastically reduced the individual power of planeswalkers, and with the War of the Spark, where they basically closed up all the portals and drastically reduced planeswalkers' power, got rid of like the big movers and shakers and things, and reduced it to a much more patchwork thing. You can see that they're bringing that in line with the power level of Dungeons and Dragons. To me, it's obvious. So there's very much a long-term plan where I could see 6th edition, or maybe even a 7th edition, which is the main world setting would not be Forgotten Realms. It would be Dominaria, and we'd see the War of New Phyrexia or something like that. So I can see that. And Ravnica and Theros have been pretty popular. Theros has definitely been pretty popular.
Yeah.
Ravnica, I think, was not well done because it just wasn't complete enough. You got a few city blocks of a world city. It just wasn't big enough. There's not enough to go by. Like, I don't even know what's in the core of the world apart from it squirming with worms and things. It's like, I wanted more than that. I wanted an Underdark of the subsidies under subsidies. I didn't want, this world where it just stops here sort of thing. No, I wanted Coruscant.
Yeah, exactly. It felt like Sigil from Planescape, and it's like, because that's like, well, why didn't you just make it that then? That was what I wondered about Ravnica, because if you're not going to do the whole world, then you're just going to do like a chunk of the city, and it's basically supposed to be this planner hub. why not just do Sigil, which is already that
Right.
planner hub city? But I mean, I get they wanted. I think was it James Wyatt who did that. He really wanted to bring in Magic into D&D because he'd also
Mm,
written the same author. He did a bunch of the adaptation of the other Magic the Gathering settings for 5e and D&D as part of the release of their art anthology books for Magic the Gathering, and
right.
those really well done PDFs too. Like I still reference them for a lot of stuff because they had some great ideas in them. But I do think they're going for that multiverse, and
Yeah.
I hope we get there. I hope. I think that they've been hinting at a multiversal, like a hybrid Spelljammer Planescape subject for a long time, or
Hmm.
campaign setting for a long time. I think we're gonna get that soon. Maybe this year, maybe next year, but I think that's gonna kind of really be setting the tone for what like default future D&D is going to be. And I think it is going to be a lot
Yeah.
more like Magic, where the idea is you're playing D&D and there's all these different worlds that you're kind of like going to for your flavor of game, and that's going to be the default now, instead of like, oh, everyone's on Tyrell for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And then maybe we could
I'd
get an
like to
actual.
see them expand into the entire star system, and it won't necessarily be realm space. I don't think they're going to go the Spelljammer flying through space in a galleon sort of thing with um, with great spheres and things like that around the crystal spheres and the phlogiston. I don't know if they're going that way. They may just have it regular space, and then you can sort of use the astral sea or the
Mhm.
ethereal plane as hyperspace, because
Yeah,
that's what a modern audience is more used to. They've never read the Barsoom series. They've
right.
never played Space 1889 or whatever it was called back in the
Mhm.
day. So they don't have that experience of like that's it's very, very weird. Spelljammer is very weird. And it was weird back when we played it, and it's even weirder now.
Yeah,
So I don't know if they're going to go that way.
yeah, it was definitely part of it, that kind of almost psychedelic or gonzo era
Mm-hmm.
of just sci-fi and fantasy in general. That, yeah, I
Yeah,
think like Guardians of the Galaxy is the closest thing that I think modern audiences will have seen to that, and it doesn't even come close
exactly.
to the madness
No,
that's in Spelljammer.
not even scratching the surface. Like they're flying inside the head of a giant celestial being that's being
Mm-hmm.
mined for its brain matter and stuff like that. That's Tuesday in Spelljammer.
Uh-huh.
That's not even weird.
Yeah, there's a giant asteroid that orbits around Tyrell that looks like a giant dwarf head with a beard. You fly into its mouth, and it's got a whole race of like white-haired dwarves, the Whitebeards,
Yep.
that live there, and they send down missions every 100 years to all the dwarven or all the dwarven strongholds throughout the planet. To, oh god, what is it? I
And their
think I
ships are powered by workshops. Like
yeah,
creativity powers their ships.
yeah. So it's
Work harder.
like that's the type of thing I see being released as somebody's like Kickstarter zine game these days. Something like
Yeah,
Mark Borg or something like that.
yeah,
Shadow of the Demon Lord. Yeah, but I think you're right, and like we are headed there toward the D&D Magic the Gathering singularity. I think it'll be
mm,
good when we finally get there. I think there's a lot of growing pains and a lot of griping that's going to happen until we do.
yeah.
Um,
But of course, with the evolution of something, it starts off, a little bit sketchy and a little bit like hit and miss and things. And perhaps, they're not going 100% into it because they're not too sure how it's going to go. But I can see that there's definitely would there be a drive from Wizards of the Coast, and that's Wizards of the Coast seems to be rising up the ranks of Hasbro. Really, I think it's much more important to Hasbro than people think it is. Anyway, I can see them heading that way because it doesn't make any sense to have two different stables of lore creators. People who are
right.
making the Magic Gathering the lore, and then people who are making the Forgotten Realms lore and stuff, and they're definitely migrating and joining the two together.
Well, and in an age
Um,
where like shipping and production and manufacturing is getting more difficult and less practical, as well as less
yeah,
ethical, just because we know it's destroying the planet, IP is where it's gonna be at for a
yeah,
corporation like Hasbro, and they're obviously realizing that and investing in that, in strengthening the like big IPs that they have that move digital products, which are the
yeah.
easiest for them to produce.
And I
Um,
can see it too, like with the speed that they're producing new sets of cards for Magic the Gathering, which is
mhm.
necessary because of the way that the game just operates, and particularly with their digital arm of playing Magic the Gathering, which I quite enjoy. That the lore progresses at a much more rapid pace for Magic the Gathering than it does for Dungeons and Dragons and Forgotten Realms and stuff. So it's kind of hampered producing these source books one after the other. That's the reason why they've been very generic and not very specific and things. I think it's kind of crazy that they've done this whole advancing timeline thing. Why not just, keep the Forgotten Realms dateless? Like, it could be any time in particular, or maybe have different eras of Dungeons and Dragons in the Forgotten Realms. So my idea is produce a source book from 6260, the year of Oath Forsaken, before the Sword Coast even had human cities and things like that. And you've got these, Thay was this land of centaurs, and Schult had a serpent kingdom next to it and things like that. And there was great elven kingdoms in the north and stuff. It was really the golden age before, and Netheril was still, at its height before Castus's folly, destroyed that. So you have the best of everything going off. And so what we've got now in Forgotten Realms is a post-apocalyptic setting that's heading towards another apocalypse where dragons are now free of their Dragon Rage mythal and can start taking over kingdoms again. And the giants are released from the Ordning to rampage and do whatever they want.
And demons are trying to come up through the Underdark. And
and swallowing cities.
It's been devils are stealing cities into hell. Like, it's just been constant apocalypses in the Forgotten Realms ever since. Though I think you touched on the one issue with that ancient setting. You mentioned Netheril still being around. I know that the Netheril box set still leaves a bad taste in the mouths of most of the members of the Candlekeep forums and writers of the Forgotten Realms, and they have never forgiven Slade.
Yeah, Slade. I was just going to say Slade, that pirate. I can see myself being in the same position if I produce some content. It'll be like, well, you asked me to make some stuff. Here we go. Yeah. So I'm going to take people on this is my year ahead. My plan for my next Kickstarter is to take people down the southern coast and take them on a real ride, and hopefully visit Deep Imasca finally.
Ooh, going to the actual Forgotten Realms, everything outside of the Sword Coast. And there's so much cool stuff to explore in the rest of it, which is why it's a shame they haven't done like a true campaign book for it yet.
Yeah.
So we've been talking for a while, but one thing I really did want to ask you directly, we've touched on it a bunch, is what is it about RPGs that speaks to you, that you find fulfilling? Like, it's been part of your life. Like you said, you were born to it, you were built to it. It's given you a lot of great friendships. It's how you relate to people. But what is it about them that you find just so engaging?
Imagination. It gives my very active mind something to build in. So it's a playground where I'm just constantly modeling and imagining new things. And I can't imagine what other medium aside from filmmaking where I could be so creative. And filmmaking, of course, would be glacially slow compared to being able to produce adventure after adventure after adventure. Being able to play all these multiple characters and things like that allows me to step outside of my own skin and really expand my consciousness into being empathetic for different positions and people and the way that they see the world and things. So I deliberately go out of my way to make characters that are different from me. I'm very much a role player. Yeah. So game systems and things, like I've seen a lot of different gaming systems and things. It's not specifically one game or the other. It's the act of role playing that I really enjoy. And it's the friendships and the camaraderie and the shared stories that you have, particularly being involved in a campaign that went for over like 6 years and seeing that develop and things, and have aspects to that game that no gaming medium or entertainment medium or even activity that you have with your friends could match. Like, you want to talk about in-jokes, you try a 6-year campaign with a friend. Like there's words that we use in our social circle which are made up lizard man words. Like, for instance, when I say it's Harktis, my friends understand that it means forbidden. It's dangerous, don't get near it.
One of my oldest groups, which unfortunately hasn't met in a while now because of COVID, but they were together since I think like 78 or 79, and I joined about a decade and a half ago and then took over as DM, the second DM to ever DM the group at one point. And and it's just crazy that bond that's created and those experiences that are there. So, final question. What do you wish I had asked you, and how would you have answered?
Well, what's my next upcoming project, which I sort of started touching on. So I do plan on actually producing a couple of books for a Kickstarter this year. Hopefully it'll sort of kick off around the end of the year, because it's going to take me a while to get this organized. So what I plan on doing is producing a free PDF of the text of the books, so anybody will be able to download it and read the content for free. And that sort of gets me out of the copyright loop, because there's a kind of a loophole with Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast, and that if you produce content that's free for anybody to watch, they don't really worry, what you're putting in there.
Right.
So I'm not making money off their IP, but for the Kickstarter, it will be you'll basically be paying for the hardcover book and the artwork and all that sort of stuff that goes into it. So what I want to produce is a story of the Sage of Candlekeep, my alternate character, Picaroon, the lore master of the High Hand Spire, who lives in Candlekeep and travels each year across the world to different locations and things, and produces these videos that I produce. So he's like my in-game character. He's my in-game representation, kind of like Ed Greenwood is Mert the Moneylender, or not Elminster. No,
Though
he's more Mert the Moneylender.
He's Elminster too.
He
He denies it, but
and Todd Kendrick is Mordenkainen, and don't let anybody tell you different. Anyway, so as the Sage travels across the southern coast, he gets his objective is to get to Karatur. He wants to finally investigate Karatur and discover whether it's actually there or not, because he knows that there's this empire across the entire far to the east. And he goes down past Arm and Tether and across the Shining Sea, and kind of gets repelled from it, some mishaps. He goes to the Lake of Steam, and he discovers the ruins of the ancient Illitheri civilization there, the origin of the Drow elves. And then he goes across and gets to Helruer, and he's trying to secure an air passage on an airship from Helruer across the southern states along the sword, the southern coast, and of course Lurin, the land of his people, because he's a dire halfling, so he's half halfling, half human, with a little bit of brass elf and his brass dragon in his genetic history. Anyway, what happens is he eventually gets to the plane of purple dust, and something happens there, and he wakes up back in Lake Veldorn or Estegund or somewhere like that, and with no memory of what transpired. But he takes out his journal and opens it up and discovers that he's actually visited Deepa Maskar, and he's had his memory wiped. But they never got his journal. And so that's what's going to be in this book.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, companion to this will be on my Discord server, I've had a very hardworking bunch of people on a channel we call the Monster Mash. And the idea is that they produce all sorts of new monsters and things like that. And we'll put together an actual book, and they'll get paid contribution they've made to it as part of the Kickstarter. So it'll be a companion book full of stats and lore and things of all these creatures that exist along the southern coast, and the ethereal plane, and the Lake of Steam, and the sea of, the Shining Sea, and all these places that you haven't visited before. So it'll be a grab bag of new monsters and artifacts and lore and flora and fauna, and talking about the plants and the forests and all that sort of stuff. So it's very much a very immersive, what's it actually like to be. You've got the first person perspective of the Sage as he's traveled and had all these encounters across the southern states. So you get to be eyes on the ground experience of what Helruer is like and things like that. And so in my videos that I've been producing on my channel, I've been much more focused on the story aspect of that, and producing these little story snippets at the start of the videos before I get into the sort of the lore and things. But it's the experience of the Sage, and what it's like to be in the cities of Arm, and what it's like to encounter an Oram Vorax and things like that.
Well, and that's got a very storied history in the realms too, of course, because Volo's guides are some of the greatest D&D books that were ever put out, and Volo is a very famous explorer and ne'er-do-well in the realms. It's nice that he got to
he gets a lot of shit from other sages.
Yeah, he does. Well, and Ed's always been very open about the fact that Volo also wrote a bunch of erotica under some bad pseudonyms. But yeah, very much like kind of Marco Polo, but also not. But he has been, the perspective that we got on the realms, and that's a big part of how Ed always wanted to present the realms, was from the view of the person who's interacting with this at the ground level, and not that kind of macro detached, like the old Greyhawk, Gazetteer and stuff, where it's just pure stats on here's the makeup of this place and what the resources are and the names and lineage of their royalty and stuff.
Right.
And the Realms is more about what's the local food like in that hamlet that you're in.
Yeah. As a dire halfling, of course, I'm very, very focused on food. Yeah,
Oh,
and as a foodie myself.
that's one
So
of the
yeah.
questions I ask players in my games is for your character, like what's their favorite meal and drink? Because I think that really, if you think about it, like it tells you a lot about them. And even if they don't put thought into it, it still tells you about something about how they conceive the character and how they think about them.
A brace of roasted conies and some mashed potatoes.
Oh man, now I'm getting hungry. Well,
Me too.
Speaking of, we've been talking for quite a while. I really appreciate your time. These answers have been fascinating. I'm definitely going to have to interview you again because there's just so much more that we have to dive into. But if people want to find you online, besides looking up AJ Pickett on YouTube and watching the literally hundreds of lore videos about D&D and magic and just all kinds of stuff related to that, where else can people find you online?
So I'm by proxy, they can find me on all of the Sages groups on Facebook. So if you type in Sages of Forgotten Realms, Sages of Eberron, Sages of Greyhawk, you will those are groups that we operate. Me and my friend Anthony, the admins of those groups. And
Anthony.
Yeah. And so those groups are good because they don't have a lot of politics. They're not very general. They don't have lots of, advice for the games and arguments about additions and things like that. They're really just focused on the lore, answering questions about those specific world settings. So Forgotten Realms, Sages of Forgotten Realms is exactly what it sounds like. We are sages that research the Forgotten Realms and present information about them. So, yeah, in that regard, it's a very welcoming and open and good and safe community that doesn't get very controversial. Yeah.
And a wonderful group of sages are there too. Like a lot of the writers and authors that help create this lore participate in all of those groups.
Yeah. So general D&D groups are great, like 5th edition D&D group and the Asterix alternate sort of uncensored, more open group are good, but the specific focused groups are really good value as well. That's our general policy is we've got 3 simple rules, which is respect for your fellow sages, only post information about the specific rule setting that the group is for, and basically don't put anything copyright protected on there. So no pirating and sharing of pirating sites and things like that. That's it. And we enforce those rules for everybody. And the only other place really of interest is my Discord channel, which you can find linked on my Facebook, on my YouTube channel, and of course my Spring store where you can buy your fresh merchandise.
The mighty the-mighty-glue-stick.creator-spring.com, correct?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
There will be a link in the description if I remember to put it in there. I definitely will.
If you do notice that the deeply nerdy shirt and you grab yourself a tasty beverage shirt have some elements of the same design that MCDM Studios, Matt Colville, used for his t-shirt a couple of years ago. He's got a new t-shirt design now. You should go and check it out. That is an homage to how fantastic that t-shirt is, and I just wanted to produce something as beautiful.
Oh yeah, well, and Matt Colville, also another YouTube creator that has just made some fantastic contributions to D&D and gaming.
Absolutely changed the landscape of Kickstarter for book producers of role playing material as well.
Oh really?
Yeah, he when he produced Strongholds and Followers, it broke a lot of records, and it sort of came out of nowhere because before then, it was like he had established his audience through his social media, through his content that he produced on YouTube. Really, he's an author, so he'd produced a series of books before then, and he's working in the game industry and has worked in the game industry for many years, and so he's established this audience through YouTube with his books on how to run his videos on how to run the game and things, and then he produces this book on Kickstarter, and all of a sudden he's got this client base of people who immediately back it, and that came out of nowhere because it appeared like independent of Kickstarter. If you weren't aware of who he was, all of a sudden he produces this book and bam, it gets this massive amount of backers. And then what happened was that the marketing engine behind that and just the way that people operate as consumers, the more people backed it, the more must back it became. And so they had people who had never seen or heard of Matt Colville who saw this hugely popular Kickstarter and said, oh, well, I better back it then because so many other people have backed it. It must be good. And next thing you know, Matt Colville's producing a video where he's just staring at the camera because he's just earned $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that blew his mind. It blew the industry's mind, and it threw open the doors for everybody to follow this method, which is produce content, create an audience, and then produce a product for that audience rather than the other way around.
Mm-hmm. And he's really been able to push, where D&D, the direction that D&D is going to, through the content that he's been creating and what he's been releasing.
Oh, his Arcadia magazine. If you're not subscribed to Arcadia, if you're not a Patreon member of MCDM Studios, do so. Arcadia is the new Dragon magazine. It's absolutely fantastic.
Oh, yes. I've been a subscriber since it launched, and I was the one kid that bought Dragon magazine from my local game shop like every month when it came out, and I still have a giant stack of those. So
at some point, Matt Colville, if you ever listen to this, love you, buddy, please, at some point, do a Kickstarter that actually produces physical copies of those magazines, because I buy them.
Yeah. Even just like an anthology collection or something. Yeah.
First 10 issues of Arcadia on a hardcover, leather bound, couple of ribbons.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
Gold foil, embossed, bit of hologram. Lovely.
And with a fully digitally enabled PDF that has hot links to videos on the things that he's talking about.
Yeah, and the soundtrack.
Yeah, I think Guy Sklanders actually was doing that for the PDF for his How to Be a Great GM book that he just did on Kickstarter as well. Speaking of other giant gaming influencers on YouTube. But it has been great talking to you. I know we could go on longer here. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the Matt Colville and MCDM fan show. I genuinely love those guys there, but it's been great talking with you, AJ, and I think the world of you and the work that you do, and you are a D&D scholar, like an actual D&D scholar, and you're not the only
one. An actual professional sage, yeah.
Yeah, a professional sage, and you are one of a vanguard of actual scholars and sages in gaming and D&D specifically that are doing serious work on it these days, and it's incredible times that we live in. So thank you so much for being here and answering my questions.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been great. And everyone, please check out AJ on YouTube. Check out the Sages groups on the Forgotten Realms. And tune in for our next episode. Thanks.